Welcome to 21st Century Radio. I'm Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. Laura Kortner is our executive producer, and Anita Brockington, our engineer. Our guest this hour is Harvey "Sluggo" Wasserman. He is an American journalist, author, democracy activist, and advocate for renewable energy. He has been a strategist and organizer in the anti-nuclear movement in the United States for over 30 years and has been a featured speaker on Today, Nightline, National Public Radio, CNN, Lou Dobbs Tonight, and other major media outlets. His newest book, The People's Spiral of U.S. History, From Jigonsaseh to Solartopia, says this at the beginning, quote, "Our mother was indigenous, our father a Puritan. The fierce genetic contradictions of our raucous double helix blasted through 6 shortening cycles which became a spiral and then ended. It comes at the end of our imperial spiral, at the brink of extinction, as we face a corporate imperial autocracy defined by horrific injustice, cultural chaos, nuclear suicide, ecological collapse. Our indigenous feminist core demands a sustainable synthesis with our macho, imperial, Puritan techno drive. It's an evolutionary leap our species must make to survive. We're virtually, says Wasserman, out of time and space, but a new millennial generation and a Solartopian vision give us hope." Welcome back to 21st Century Radio, Harvey.
Well, great to be with you. It's an honor. I appreciate it.
Well, the book is fantastic. I can't wait to see one in full print rather than online. And I love the illustrations because it makes it so easy to understand. Talk to us first about the overall concept you had when you kind of flashed onto this.
Well, it's actually 50 years ago.
Uh-huh.
What happened was I, for some reason, was always going to be a teacher. It's always what I wanted to do. And then I got into the University of Michigan. I became a history major and thought I'd be a history professor. And along the way, I was exposed to 2 very important historians. One's name was William Appleman Williams, and he was a professor of history at Wisconsin and had a theory of cycles of history, which I thought was really, really interesting. And then the other was a guy named Howard Zinn, a professor of history at Boston University, and he had a very bottom-up view of U.S. history. And so I synthesized the 2, and I wrote a book that was published in 1972 about the U.S. from 1860 to 1920, from the Civil War to World War I. And it was published by Harper & Row. It actually sold about 30,000 copies. I wanted to call it A People's History of the United States. They thought that was too whatever, and they called it Harvey Wasserman's History of the United States. Today they'd call it Sluggo's History of the United States. But this one, so I had the idea molded in my brain for 50 years, back to the 1970s, and I drew an actual, and you've seen an actual diagram of U.S. history in terms of cycles, and then another one in terms of the spiral, which, because the cycles, as you said, have gotten shorter. And we are basically now at the end of our life cycle. Our life cycle really ended in the 1990s when the computer revolution and the internet basically tied the world together. And you know, we are now essentially as a species and as some sort of advanced mind meld. And so the United States obviously still exists, but we're no longer the separate organism that we were up to the 1990s. You know, we've lived in isolation, surrounded by the 2 oceans and Mexico and Canada, and we've never been invaded, thank goodness. So, you know, what happens now is that we are part of a global entity, and how we deal with it is the great test.
When you look at these cycles and you talk about, you know, the ages of a nation the same way as the ages of a person, we started with our Puritan DNA and against our indigenous DNA. As you point out, Mother Earth's matriarchs nurture our nation, whereas the Puritan DNA was the cult of God, the Father, and a city on the hill. I mean, I love your language. It's just so precise.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And yes, we are. What people don't understand, and this history book is really the first to do it, is that our democracy, to the extent that the United States or American society in more general terms is a democracy, is due to the Indians, to the indigenous, specifically the Haudenosaunee, or people of the Longhouse, that we generally call the Iroquois. When the whites came to North America, the French and the British primarily in North America, in northern United States and Canada, they encountered a very, very advanced a confederacy. There were 5 tribes. There's 6 now, but there were 5 tribes at the time: the Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Seneca, and Cayuga. And they stretched across what's now upstate New York. They had been at war for centuries. And, boy, you did not want to go to war with the Haudenosaunee or the Iroquois. They were absolutely ferocious and unbeatable in their own territory. And the only thing that defeated them ultimately was disease. But we can talk about that later. But what happened was the 5 tribes were at war with each other, and there came a holy man, either a spirit or an actual person named the Ganawida, and he couldn't talk well. He was a stutterer, so he teamed up with a chief named Hiawatha, who was a great speaker. And they were going around uniting the tribes and getting them to be at peace with each other. And along the way, they encountered, and this is the Haudenosaunee history, oral history, they encountered a matriarch, and her name was Jigonsaseh. And the 3 of them had to encounter a tribal chieftain who was a warrior, the legend has that he had snakes in his hair, and that Jigonsaseh combed the snakes out of his hair. His name was Tadodaho, and he became the peace chief of the Iroquois nation. What the Americans and the English and the French wound up encountering with them was a very, very advanced democracy. In fact, the Iroquois Confederacy, was the most advanced democracy in the world. And it's hard for people to understand that. We look to Europe. There were no democracies in Europe. The Haudenosaunee Confederacy started in 1540. There was no country in Europe you would call a democracy in the 1540s, and they had the 5 tribes retained their sovereignty, but they all sent a chieftain or a number of chieftains to a representative Congress, and that's how the decisions were made. But this is the key, Zoe, and I know you're going to love this, and I know you know it already. The Iroquois, as were many of the tribes and nations in North America, the Iroquois were a matriarchy. That means the women ran the show. And they kept the house, they ran the gardens, they raised the children, and they made the key decisions. The men went hunting and sat around and said important things. And there's a great quote. I used to show this documentary in my classes when I was teaching history. And there's a woman named Audrey Shenandoah, and I guess you know her sister. And Audrey Shenandoah was asked in a documentary film, why was it that if the women ran the Iroquois nation and the tribes, the men were chiefs? And she said, I couldn't make this up. She said, well, it gives them something to do, and it makes them feel important.
And it was also the women who, if somebody was erratic or didn't live up to their responsibilities, they voted them out. I mean, my husband and his assistant, Laura Courtner, have written a book on this, and Bob's written a number of books on the League of the Iroquois and their impact on the founding fathers, Ben Franklin, Thomas Jefferson himself, etc. And you're absolutely right, and it's just so tragic that it's not in our history books. Our kids aren't ever taught this, and yet now, as you point out, the millennials are a little more awake, and I think they understand that this indigenous practice is really where we need to go, and why often people are saying, particularly relative to ecocide and the destruction of our earth, that it's the elders' traditions that are going to preserve this earth if we pay attention.
Yes, and it's the elder women.
Yeah.
I mean, we are long overdue for a matriarchy. The most powerful national leader in Europe for a long time has been Angela Merkel, and we had a bad experience with Maggie Thatcher, but nonetheless, women are now, there are now more than 100 women in the U.S. Congress. We actually have a state legislature that's now a majority of women. You know which one it is, Zoe?
No.
Nevada.
Huh?
The Nevada
Interesting.
legislature is now a majority of women, and they have at least one female senator. So the pendulum is swinging back. And, you know, my history book is now, The People's Spiral of History, U.S. history, is now the one that says, hey, look, you know, democracy comes from the indigenous. They had a matriarchy. The key person, you mentioned Washington and Franklin, they both understood how sophisticated the Iroquois were. I mean, Washington was a warrior, and he certainly slaughtered plenty of Indians, but he did understand how advanced they were. But the key was Franklin. Franklin, who was the great genius of the American founding, really respected the Iroquois. He reprinted their speeches. And if Ben Franklin was alive today and you asked him what was the number one influence on the American Constitution, he would instantly tell you it was the Iroquois Confederacy. Now, you know, I was criticized by an indigenous woman, a great scholar, who doesn't want any blame for American democracy to fall on the indigenous. But, you know, to the extent that our society is democratic with a small d, it comes from the Iroquois. And the Cherokee and the Hopi also were very matriarchal. Not all the Northern American tribes were matriarchal, but those three certainly. And the Iroquois were just, you know, light years ahead of any government in Europe, starting in the 1540s. There was a incredibly sophisticated. They had a Bill of Rights, 113 codicils, they were called. The level of freedom in the Iroquois nation was staggering to the Europeans. The Europeans basically had a hard time getting their head around the ideas of freedom that the indigenous were living by. It's, you know, and it's definitely true that the French contact with the Iroquois is what sparked the French Revolution. And the American Revolution came right because of the Iroquois were right there, and the Americans who, you know, the displaced English who came to North America and founded the United States, it was all, the ideas of freedom all came from the Iroquois and the other tribes. And that's in no history books, except now it's in mine, so people can read it.
Well, and I love your chart of the American DNA. On the left is indigenous, on the right is Puritan, and you start at the very top. The indigenous, Mother Earth is, you know, revered, and in the Puritan, it's God the Father. In the indigenous, common land, and in the Puritan, private land. In the indigenous, sacred natural unity. In the Puritan, war on nature, and we go on from there. And you speak to this reality, you know, in Kabbalah, which I am a student of and have written 2 books about, they speak to this issue of Malchut, which is the bottom of the tree of life, which represents the moon and women. And they say it's inevitable that we are moving into this time period on Earth of matriarchy, and that it's essential. This is not a social political position. It's about an ethos of care. And even the animals that I have worked with and wrote a book about speak to that this is what humanity has lost, is this ethos of care where the mother and child were really the center about which an entire culture revolved, and their welfare and benefit. And you look at our current culture in America, and it's anything but that.
Yeah, it's horrible. I mean, you have a rapist in the White House, for God's sakes. But this, you know, I see Trump in this period we're going through as the last gasp. I mean, if you're a white man, you know, a white European, and you call yourself a Christian, and I don't know how these people can call themselves Christians, and we can talk about that, but, you know, you're looking at a world, you're looking at a country that's being completely transformed. I mean, the reason they're screaming about immigration, frankly, the horse is out of the barn. You know, the demographics of the United States are being completely remade. The country will be, whites will not be a majority in the United States by 2050, probably a lot earlier. And you have states like Florida, Texas, California, which, well, California is no longer a majority white. White people are between 40 and 50% of the population in California. And that's been true of New Mexico for a while also. So what's happened here is that you had basically the baby boomers, and this is all part of it, the baby boom generation, which comes at the end of the spiral of U.S. history, did remake the culture. We did have a cultural revolution. I'm 74. I was born actually 8 hours before the baby boom. The demographic of the baby boom starts January 1st, 1946, officially. And I was born December 31st, 1945. So I'm technically not a baby boomer. But the baby boom...
We'll let you into the club.
Thank you. I appreciate that. I need an identity. So but the baby boom, and we were very conscious of this. We transformed the culture. I mean, you just had Pete Buttigieg dropping out of the race, but the idea of a gay guy running for president, even 10 years ago, was inconceivable. I mean, no openly gay people could run for office. Tammy Baldwin became the first gay senator openly. I'm sure there have been plenty of gay senators and congresspeople, but none open. In fact, I personally met the first gay congressman, openly gay. His name was Jerry Studs. He was from Massachusetts, from Provincetown, actually. And one of the reasons I love history, his first name is Jerry, Gerry, and he's a direct descendant of Elbridge Gerry, who invented gerrymandering.
Oh, fascinating.
There you go.
Fascinating.
But
Look,
nonetheless...
I was going to tell you, we do have to take a break, and then we'll come back because, the way you've written the people's spiral of U.S. history makes it so accessible to anybody, and the way in which you present the American DNA between indigenous and Puritan simplifies a lot of discussion that, I've had thousands of hours of discussions about these things, as has my husband. And yet I have to say, to your credit, you have done such a masterful job of not only using a language that is really smart talk. It's not academic, and I'm so grateful that it's not, because it will reach so many more people. And I hope our listeners will get a copy of The People's Spiral of U.S. History. It's an educational publisher, Biblio Publishing 2019. Learn more at www.solartopia.org.
Hello, this is Pete Leiden, the founder of reInvent. You can find us at reinvent.net. We're a group that pulls together top innovators across America, even across the world, to really work on solving complex challenges and actually reinventing our world. And today you are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Harvey Wasserman is our guest. His newest book, The People's Spiral of U.S. History, for Jigonsaseh. How do you say that name? Jigonsaseh.
Jigonsaseh.
There we are. Jigonsaseh to Solartopia. Educational publisher, Biblio Publishing release of 2019. Go to www.solartopia.org. And as Harvey has told us already, if you want to write him about any of the campaigns they're doing on election clarity in the various states across the United States, you can write them at solartopia@gmail.com. So as you shared with us, everything American is rooted among the countless diverse societies, quote, that were here so long before Columbus. And we're talking about the matriarchal indigenous people's lives and livelihood. And you say, now a revived matriarchy is poised for rebirth and not a moment too soon. We left off, Harvey, with you talking about how baby boomers revolutionized the culture. And in what ways?
In all ways. I mean, if you look at the music, the way people dress, the way people think, sex, drugs, rock and roll, I mean, it's easy to lose track because we live in a certain world now. But if you go back, God forbid, to say 1959, and you look at what was going on, I mean, Elvis had just come on the scene. There was some black music around. If you started in 1950, then it's really the Dark Ages. And we take for granted things now in the culture, especially sexuality, but certainly ways of looking at the world. There was no environmental movement at the time.
Yeah.
We didn't conceive of the world as a biological entity that needed to be protected. There was no I mean, if you were gay, you were one step away from prison. I mean, it was illegal to be gay in much of the United States. Black, it was not legally protected for blacks and whites to marry each other till 1967. I mean, so that's a big part of my book. I call it the Greatest Awakening. In the spiral of our history, in the cycles, there's always a part of the cycle, a springtime, where there's a cultural revolution. And it happened in the 1740s and 50s. It was called the Great Awakening. It happened in the 1830s and 40s and 50s. That was the Transcendental Era, and you can actually get a small taste of that in the movie Little Women. Came a little later, but that was kind of that milieu. In the early 1900s, there was the birth of jazz, and a lot of white middle-class young people were starting to use pot, and peyote actually made its way into New York City, and there was dancing. There was a sexual revolution that went on. There was gay people. Actually, the first person to speak openly, politically, about being gay in the United States happened in the early 1900s. Her name was Emma Goldman. And she famously said, if I can't dance, I don't want to be in your revolution. But she also was the first to speak openly about homosexuality. You also had Margaret Sanger in the birth of Planned Parenthood. So it started to be a sexual revolution. It escalated in the 1930s, and then it just completely exploded in the 1960s. And a lot of us were pretty aware of what was going on in terms of destroying the old Puritan culture. And then now you have, these people hanging on for dear life with a culture that they can't even begin to comprehend, but which has completely changed. The problem is, and, I could go on for hours about this. I took a fair amount of LSD. I took a fair amount of mescaline. They were great. I took peyote a couple times. They really changed my way. And if you can describe your acid trip, you really didn't take it. So, but the bottom line is, and spirituality also, there's a great influx of interest in Buddhism through these springtimes. Thoreau and Emerson, both in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s, both studied Buddhism and Hinduism and understood a lot of what was going on. There was a world conference on religion in the 1890s that had a strong Buddhist tinge to it and all that. But in the 1960s, Eastern religion became a huge driver of the Cultural Revolution, and that's gone on to the point where, combined with yoga, that part of the culture has really been changed as well. So the question is not, did we transform the culture? I think that goes without saying. It's, why did we fail to deal with the empire? And, Donald Trump is a classic end of empire nutcase, like Caligula or Commodus, if you've seen the movie Gladiator, or these guys who came into Greece and Rome as they were on their way down. And that's what Trump is. He's the last gasp of the old order. And the question is, will we survive it? And that's, I think it's going to be a close call.
Well, and as you say, we've just passed out of our imperial senility. That's we're flatlining into the imperial zombie coma, which you said was Clinton, Bush 2, and Obama. And then now in Trumpocalypse, you said, quote, our imperial vultures come home to roost, getting to Solartopia, to life after Trump. So let's talk about getting to Solartopia and what it means, because you make 8 very, quote, green steps to get there. You want to go through some of those?
Sure. Basically, what we have to understand is that Trump is the composite, and the understanding Trump is essentially getting there, as they say. Trump is the composite of all the horrible dictators we've put in power in other countries. He is our karma.
Yeah.
Come home to roost here. Because, I hate to say it in this certain sense, but we deserve Trump. Because if you compare him to the horrible dictators we've imposed on other countries, Pinochet in Chile and Suharto in Indonesia, and these torturers and murderers and thieves, Trump is just one of them. And he's come back to us because we have imposed people like him on other countries. Now, the good news is that, we have the technology to have a Solartopia. We can get 100% of our energy from solar, wind, batteries, and increased efficiency. It's all there. We know how to do farming organically. There are all sorts of things. We haven't found a substitute for plastic yet, and that is absolutely critical. We've got to find a way to stop using this plastic. It's killing us, and it will kill us even worse as we go ahead. So, and there are other keys that we haven't found yet. But a lot of it, as you well know, being in the spiritual mode, we know we have. We have the kind of spirituality available to us that can get us to Solartopia. The 8 green steps, as you mentioned, first is to ban fossil and nuclear fuels, okay? We can't burn anything anymore for energy. We need to convert to renewables. We know that. We've talked about that. We need total efficiency, and we also need to revive mass transit. And I think one of the hopeful signs is the revolution we're having in bicycles. Bicycles, as far as I'm concerned, are the greatest of all human inventions, and they're spreading all over and really changing a lot of things. And we need to raise sustainable organic food, okay? We know how to do that, and we know that all the Earth's food could be raised organically, and actually needs to be raised organically. Chemical agriculture and monoculture are a failure, and there's something that we really need to learn from the indigenous. The indigenous, especially the Iroquois, were master farmers. There's a wonderful book called 1491 by a guy named Charles C. Mann, who describes how the Indians managed the forests and the fields. It's quite amazing, actually. Then we need to transform the number one institution that's killing us. The number one institution that is murdering the world is the corporation. The corporation is like a virus. It has human rights, but no human responsibility. And so a corporation does not care about preserving the earth or social justice or any of that stuff. All it cares about is profit. And it's an institutional structure that needs to be dismantled, because that's the root of all our problems, is the nature of the corporation, which has no link, no feedback mechanism to human biology or the global ecology, or fairness or justice, or an end to war or any of that stuff. So we need to ban waste, and we need to ban war. War is the most wasteful thing humans do, and it's the most suicidal, and war has got to stop. And Trump is, of course, saying, it's so weird, and again, history is so complicated. He's pulling us out of Afghanistan, which Obama should have done a long time ago. If Obama had gotten us out of Afghanistan, he would be one of our greatest presidents. He had a choice. Right after he got the Nobel Prize, he could have pulled us out, or put us further in. He put us further in, and that is one of the reasons that Trump is in the White House. And here now we are in this election, and Trump is allegedly pulling out of Afghanistan. We'll see. But simultaneously, he's putting us into space with war, which is, a nightmare.
Yeah.
Then the 7th step is to achieve social justice or true democracy, which is what Bernie Sanders was about. And socialism is sort of an afterthought. What you really need to have is a system where everybody is taken care of. All human beings have dignity. They have the right to education, housing, clothing, medical care, transportation, and food. And once those basics are taken care of, everything else falls into place. That's social democracy. It's not necessarily socialism. And that gives us true democracy. And then finally, number 8, and actually in the other ones I've moved it up, but is empower women or restore matriarchy. And I think that men have had, I apologize for my gender here, I think that men have had more than enough time to demonstrate whether or not they can run the earth, and obviously they can't and cannot, and women need to take over. So there you go. Take over, Zoe.
Well, again, back to so many much more ancient traditions, whether it's the Jewish mystic tradition of Kabbalah or the Hindu tradition or the Buddhist tradition. They all speak of these enormously long cycles, back to millions, if not billions of years in the Hindu systems, that talk about civilizations rising and falling and rising and falling. And we will not be the first civilization to fall as a result of patriarchy. I mean, there's a long, long history of this reality. But the truth is if we plug in reincarnation, sometimes we're male and sometimes we're female. And the justice part of that is what we experience in each lifetime, but we're also always part male and part female in our incarnation. So it's really about expanding our intuition and expanding our capacity for love and reverence for the earth and each other, and matriarchy for those that are terrified to think that some woman's going to behave like a man and limit your opportunities and, throw you off a train. That's not what matriarchy means. It means that all of us rise to our highest good in nurturing and in caring and in taking care of all that we must. And I just think it's important because sometimes matriarchal discussions become really hot political discussions, and it's not really about politics. It's about each of us evolving to our best person. At least that's the way I see it.
Well, I like that. I like everything you said. It's absolutely true. And I think just, as I say, I'm the father of 5 daughters. I'm the Tevye of the anti-nuclear movement.
That's beautiful. Your own harem, as my father would say. That's just beautiful.
Yeah, well, I don't know. There's a question that always arises with, I have 7 granddaughters.
Fascinating.
The question always arises, if a man, a father and a grandfather, is alone in the woods, saying nothing and doing nothing, is he still wrong?
Well, we know, of course he is.
That's exactly right. Every woman gives me the same.
We know this.
Why do you even ask?
We know this. We'll be right back. Harvey Wasserman is our guest. His most recent book, The People's Spiral of U.S. History. Check it out and go to his website, www.solartopia.org. And if you want to participate in some of the election corrections with his teams around the country, you can write them at Solartopia, Solartopia, @gmail.com.
You are listening to 21st Century Radio with Dr. Zohara Hieronimus. I'm Ben Montgomery, author of Grandma Gatewood's Walk and The Man Who Walked Backward, and several other books. You can learn more about me and my work at www.gangray.com.
Welcome back to 21st Century Radio. Harvey Wasserman is with us. His newest book, The People's Spiral of U.S. History, from Jigonsaseh to Solartopia, the educational publisher of Biblio Publishing 2019. Learn more at www.solartopia.org. And don't forget, all of our programs are archived for free on iTunes and YouTube. And all links to our guests are at 21stcenturyradio.com and ZoharaOnline.com. So, Harvey, what haven't we touched on that you want to be sure we talk about, whether it's about this election or the change? Or, I did have one question because it really kind of disturbs me. I've been trying to interview a lot of the younger activists. They're not so easy to get, actually, which is interesting. But there was this whole phenomena going on for a while where in the middle of something they'd say, "What boomer?" as if to defame all boomers for having failed them. And I'm thinking, hey, these are our kids. These are our own children standing up and saying, what a mess we made. But the truth is, some of us have stayed the course since we were children, like you, like me, and millions of others you and I know.
Yeah, well, they're angry at their parents, and I don't blame them.
Uh-huh.
It's a form of rebellion. And I think that's why they like Bernie so much, in part because he's not a boomer. He's older than the boomers. And, he's more of a grandfather than a father figure at this point in time. So
that's interesting. I hadn't thought about that.
But I don't blame them. But they don't understand what came before the boomers.
Right.
Put it that way. They don't understand what we had to deal with.
Yeah.
We had to deal with the Vietnam War. And we had to walk 20 miles to school through the snow. So, it's the same kind of feeling here.
Right.
And I don't want to say, my kids, they understand more or less what we had to deal with. I think it's probably incomprehensible to many of the millennials that there was a time when gay people were shunned,
imprisoned, beat up, whatever.
There's no LGBTQ, none of this all this stuff is new. There was a war going on. I mean, you got to say one thing about Trump, and I hate to say it, but he hasn't gotten us into a war, which all the Democrats did. And so we need them to come forward now and keep doing what we're doing. And they can have all the benefits of the Cultural Revolution that we have won. We can take credit for that. And they won't understand it because it's incomprehensible to them what life would have been like in this country in 1950. But the point is, now they've got to save the earth, and they're actually not saving the earth. They got to save the ecosystem so human beings can still live on Earth, and they got to deal with the empire. They got to dismantle the military. That's the number one, because it's the military that's killing us. All this money going into war, all this money being drained out of the economy, and we knew what was going on, and the Vietnam War was just such a sickening, devastating drain on everything that we tried to do, and we're still not over it. The Vietnam War is still killing us. I mean, if you really want to, it's 16 hours, but I sat through the entire Ken Burns series on Vietnam, and there are a lot of problems with it I have politically, but he did show the Vietnamese side of the war, and you can't sit through that. I don't know what else to drive people to. I mean, the movie Platoon, a few others, The Deer Hunter, Born on the 4th of July.
Right.
But in order to really understand where we're at, these young people, these millennials, really have to understand that we inherited a military-industrial complex that has proven way more powerful than we thought it would be. I didn't think that all those years after, we'd still be looking at trillion-dollar military budgets,
and by extension, a war on the earth, a war on women, a war on minorities. I mean, we have a war economy, as I call it, the death economy. I passed that on to John Perkins, and he took it over to the G7, which I thought was great. And I think even Yoko Ono has used it. But what I call the death economy is what we have, and what we need is a life economy. It's a real shorthand way for people to grab at where we are and where we need to go. And I still use it because if you look at our medicine, it's not about preventing illness. It's about making money from death or illness. If we look at our agriculture, unless it's sustainable and non-GMO and organic, it comes out of war. And the acceptable risk strategy, that it's quite all right, like 5G rollout. That's an acceptable risk, militarized use of technology that they're focusing down on us as if it's some sort of grand gain for our communication, when in fact it's a militarized capacity to control everybody. And it's sickening when you get too close to the realities, because the media doesn't do very much about informing the public. And I'd like to end on that as your experience, because you're in the media, you have your own radio show out in LA, you have your own podcast. What's your take on what the hell has happened to our media?
It's Puritanized, and that's why in the Spiral of U.S. History, I'm grateful to be able to portray the indigenous culture. And what's amazing is how the indigenous culture has survived. And the indigenous literally are at the core of the environmental movement in this country.
Yeah,
they've been fighting the pipeline battles, and everything that the indigenous taught about democracy and about oneness with nature is still very much with us. And I think that the millennials need to understand that. And, of course, the millennials are much more diverse than we were.
Mm-hmm.
And, the baby boom generation is generally viewed probably demographically as a white European-based culture. And that we were able to revolutionize it in so many different ways is remarkable. And a lot of it does have to do with psychedelics that did come from the indigenous. But the millennials now are way more diverse, and they are able to grasp onto the lessons that the indigenous have been teaching us all along. And so, we as baby boomers have been sort of throwing off the mantle, the curse, the straitjacket of the Puritan culture. And the Puritan culture is also not talked about in the history books. People don't understand how horrible these people were. I mean, you couldn't have lasted 10 minutes in Boston in the 1640s. It was the worst. It was the most tightest totalitarian society in the history of the world, because it was isolated and it was 100% run as a totalitarian dictatorship by the Puritans. And that legacy, which people don't fully understand, these people were paranoid, they were greed-driven, they were misogynists, they were hated nature, they hated people of color, and they even hated white people who just weren't Puritan, including Catholics, for God's sakes. And sexuality, forget about it. So I don't think people understand how far we've had to come. And you really have to study Puritan Boston, which I do in the Spiral of Eosticity, right next to the indigenous culture, to understand the yin-yang that we've had to deal with. I mean, the legacy of the Puritans is threefold. Part of it is democracy, because they did elect their magistrates when the old one died. And part of it, a big part of it, is technology, because the Puritans loved technology and they were good at it because they were all about subjugating the earth. And with that came literacy. The Puritans believed that in order to get to heaven, you had to be able to read. And there's a very amusing dialogue, actually. They had a big discussion about whether they had to teach women to read, because they believed that if you couldn't read the Bible, you couldn't get into heaven. And they were afraid if it turned out women were actually human. They didn't think so, really, but they didn't want to take the chance. So they let women learn how to read. But there's a whole discussion about that. But people don't understand how far we've had to come. And, crazy as he is, Trump is the perfect Puritan. Totally hypocritical, totally greed-driven, and no empathy whatsoever. And so, and compassion. They had none. The Puritans were completely devoid of empathy and compassion. And that's the battle we face. So, we can apologize to the young people, for the millennials, for where we're at here, and, oh, boomer this and oh, boomer that, but they got to see one of the person writing this book, people can see before this great 60s revolution. And, we had a tremendous time in the 60s. It was so much fun. But, it had its downsides, and we didn't get there. We got the culture, but we didn't get the empire.
Yeah.
And the attack on Mother Earth, and that's what we got to do.
Well, and that's the part that has just always sort of blown me away, because starting at 14 and I'm now 66, and to think of all the progress we were making, and then to have so much of it undone by a dictatorship, an executive dictatorship under Trump, is just unbelievable to me. And that the courts would actually, defer to him, whether it's the Supreme Court or the local courts. And we have so much work to do. So I'm as hopeful as you are, but also, mindful that the media is not an ally to the truth anymore, in the sense of not covering issues fairly. It's either one-sided for hysteria, like this current virus thing, which one has to wonder. It was written about in a book in 1980 something about the Wuhan virus 400, that it would come in 2020.
Wow.
Yeah. I'll have to send that to you. Somebody sent that to me on my phone today, and it's I think it was why can't I remember his name? Somebody Green, who wrote the book. But anyway,
well, maybe Russell Green. But it's it's frightening, and a lot of people who believe that AIDS was an inadvertent or even a
I think it was engineered.
Engineering, and
I think it was
I've
engineered.
read a couple of things now about Wuhan, and you got to remember about the media and Trump and the system is it's a castle made of sand. Because underneath all of it is they've lost. The horse is out of the barn, and the question now is, do we survive the next couple of years? Because the clock has run out on the old Puritan culture and the stronghold. And what's happened now is that when you revolutionize a culture, everything else follows.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else is following now. That's why they're terrified. They hate Bernie and they're scared of him, but they're really terrified of AOC.
Yeah.
Because, she's a woman of color, obviously extremely bright, very aggressive, understands a whole lot that they don't want understood.
Yeah.
So
she has
see.
a very strong Mars in her chart. I had an astrologer look into her disposition, and she's a warrior for sure. And then the last thing I'd like to just sort of add to all of this is to remind everybody that everybody has a role to play in this transformation, and that nobody does it for us, that each of us has to do it in our own lives. by showing the dignity God gave us, which is to respect each other, the earth, and opinions that differ from our own, but then to make the right choices. And if we always choose things that are elevating and life-supporting, they will be good choices, and it doesn't matter how small an issue it is in your life or how large it is in the community. Harvey, closing remarks from you.
Well, a long time ago, there was a guy named Jack Kennedy who said that it was our duty to make the world safe for diversity. And it's actually diversity that's the key here. Diversity is the key to all the ecosystems. You can't have a monoculture and survive. And within the human race now, we are looking at diversity in all its glory, and it's really what's going to have to save us. And so we need to deal with Trump, and we need to deal with this generational turnover, and we need to study, as I did, in the indigenous culture and the contrast to the Puritan culture. And so the spiral of our history will take us up the evolutionary ladder. I mean, this is about evolution. This is about a core change in the human consciousness. And, that's all very woo-woo, except it's 100% true.
Exactly.
If we don't change our natural way of being and come to grips with the demands of our Mother Earth, she's going to kick us out of here. And it's going to happen very soon. So one way or the other, that's what we got to do. So protect this election, protect the right to vote, stop nuclear power and all the fossil fuel burning. We have all the tools at hand.
Amen. We indefinitely do. And follow up at www.solartopia.org and write them solartopia@gmail.com. Thank you, Harvey Wasserman.